Welcome back. Thank you for joining us for another episode. I'm joined by Chris. How are you doing today?
I'm all right, thanks, Jake. Even though we just spent an hour trying to decide what we're going to talk about today.
Showing people behind the scenes. No, we were prepared. We had multiple topics to talk about. Don't let the people know. So let's let them in on what we are going to talk about today, because you got this question this week, and I've had this question a little while ago. Someone asked me this, and I suspect we probably both had a similar response initially, where when I was first asked it, I thought, don't ask it. Like, it's a silly question. Like the answer is like, just simply don't do it. Just don't do this thing. And then I thought about it more, and I was like, well, actually, firstly, I understand that there may be some requirement to do it in some situations. Okay, some things might be out of your control. And then I thought it's actually a fairly interesting thing to think about as to what would be the best way to answer this question. So the question was, if someone can only train once a week, how would they do that? What would be the best way to set up a workout plan for once a week? Did you have a similar kind of thought pattern as me when you were presented with a question, or were you more graceful than me?
No, not at all. As soon as I had the question, or the first 2 or 3 times I had the question, I didn't receive any context. So people just asked me, how do I set up a program where I'm only training, only going to the gym once per week, not even in the context of like a bro split where they want to do, kind of one workout for each muscle group, but actually genuinely only going to the gym one time per week. But no context was provided. So I was just like, don't do that. That's silly. Just literally go twice and try and, do shorter sessions, and you must be able to make that happen.
Yeah.
More recently, people have been providing me with context. And I think really I had a couple of questions on Friday in my Instagram question session. And some people were helpful enough to provide me with the context. They explained to me that they live in an area where there are not very many gyms, and the gyms that they can go to are maybe, have limited hours. And also they work maybe shifts, or they work very long hours. And when they finish for the day, the gyms are actually closed. And so the only time they can go to the gym is this single, day at the weekend, or whenever it is that they have a day off, whatever sector they may be working in. And that context was helpful for me to realize that this is a genuine question that people want the answer to, and they're not just trolling me. They actually want to know how to organize their, kind of training sort of schedules around the fact that they have this limitation. So I think, initially I was not graceful about answering the question. Now that I've been provided with the context and I understand what the problem is, then let's answer it. Let's do the best we can.
Yeah, exactly. That's how I felt about it. And, I've had some people since tell me, they're traveling and they can only access the gym once a week. And again, in that situation, I'm like, oh yeah, I can understand why this might be a beneficial thing to talk about. And the conversation may head in this direction, but normally I would preface that sort of question when someone says, give me a plan for once a week. I would ask, are you able to train any more frequent than that? Even if it's not twice a week, could it be once every 5 days? Because I think even if you're able to do once every 5 days, that opens you up with a lot more possibilities than once every 7 days. And we'll probably talk about that a little bit more in a moment anyway. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, or at least I'm getting ahead of myself. I want to talk about a plan today. And you said we were chatting about what to talk about, and I was trying to find a plan to talk about, because it's not easy to find a plan that's once a week. And even you then suggested, well, what about a bro split where they're training a muscle once a week? And I even had a bit of a challenge finding one of those, because in the silver era, they simply didn't exist. And even when we look into the golden era, like early golden era, they also didn't particularly exist. And we've made this comment before where we see this really interesting kind of sort of shift, I guess, as we enter into the post-steroid era. And we see some things start to change and some things don't. And we do see volumes change. We see set numbers change, and maybe repetitions sometimes go a little bit higher. We see rest periods change. But early on, we don't particularly see frequency change that much. We might see like a 2-way split emerge, and then those people might train 6 days a week. But we don't particularly see per week, per muscle frequency change. And sure, much later on that will happen, and there might be some outliers in the golden era as well. But generally speaking, a lot of these plans that are using some form of a split routine, they still tend to be a 2-way split, or they might actually be an AM/PM split. So they might have like a 4-way split or something like that, but they're still doing each muscle group every second day or so because they're doing this AM, PM, however many sessions, 10 sessions a week or whatever it might be. And so it's interesting just noting that this idea of training a muscle once a week simply didn't really happen for a very long time in the history of bodybuilding. And, certainly up until, I would say, sort of, late 80s, did this not become sort of the dominant way of training. So I've not succeeded in finding a good bro split plan for you all today. And the best I've been able to present you with is a 2-way or 2 times per week 2-way split. Now, this is a plan from John McCallum. And John McCallum, you guys may not have heard about him because he did compete, but more at like an amateur level, okay? So he didn't win Mr. Universe or Olympia or anything like that. But he did write some really interesting books. So some people may have read his books or heard of his books. I think his most popular Keys to Progress, I think, is one of his. There's a few other books he's published and wrote sort of in the 60s and 70s, and potentially even later than that as well. And he was, I guess, a big proponent of what would you call it? Sort of this bridging period between the silver era and golden era, where a lot of the routines still kind of looked somewhat similar, with using, more free weight exercises, barbells, dumbbells, some of these multi-joint exercises. And I guess he was a little bit more of a traditionalist in that sense, at a time where some of these new golden era methods were being developed and were being spread. So this plan, it did come from the early 60s, and I would say it does resemble a lot of what we would see in the silver era, but the format is a little bit different. So 2-way split, and the workout 1 was repeated twice a week, Monday and Thursday, and then workout 2 was repeated twice a week, Tuesday, Friday. So workout 1, we have a squat. So barbell squat, 5 sets of 5. Now, he didn't talk about the warm-up sets here, so it's always hard to know. Often people would do like a pyramid or kind of like ramping up with the weight. So I suspect the first couple of sets may have been warm-up sets, but I'm not sure. So squat, 5 by 5. And then we have a calf raise, 5 sets of 30. A stiff leg deadlift, 5 sets of 5. A bent over barbell row for 5 sets of 5. And then we had like a back pulley exercise. I'm not sure if this was sagittal plane or if it was frontal plane. There wasn't any pictures in the article, but it was 3 sets of 10. And then a press behind the neck, so barbell behind the neck, 5 sets of 5. A dumbbell lateral raise for 3 sets of 10. And then hanging leg raise for 3 sets of 10. So that was workout 1. And then workout 2, so workout 1 was legs, back and shoulders. And then workout 2 is chest, biceps and triceps, and I guess abs as well. So workout 2, we have bench, 5 by 5. And then we have dumbbell flies, 3 sets of 10. A barbell curl, 5 sets of 5. And then incline dumbbell curls, 3 sets of 10. And then French press, so that would be, I assume that would be seated with a barbell behind the neck, 5 sets of 5. And then a triceps push down type exercise, 3 sets of 10 with a cable. And then sit-ups for 3 sets of 10. So the format actually is a little bit similar in a sense to the Dorian plan we talked about last week, where it had a sort of a larger or a multi-joint exercise for muscle, and then was followed up by a single joint or a smaller kind of muscle mass exercise for that same muscle group. So it's interesting that there's this format which is consistent, I guess, in the early golden era. What do you make of that plan?
So, yeah, a few things jump out at me, but to clarify, when we're looking at these exercises, do we have any details on sort of the plane of motion, for example, in the row? I mean, did he have a diagram of what he was doing? Or?
No, unfortunately, this article didn't have any pictures.
Okay.
And generally, when people did the row, most of the time they were doing a wider grip, more transverse.
Okay. So the row is probably a transverse plane row. The pulley exercise that follows it presumably is more likely to be a sagittal plane pull.
I would assume so. And a lot of these, because this was 1960, so a lot of the pulley type exercises they did then, they tended to be this sort of diagonal kind of like height or low type sagittal plane.
Okay. And similarly for the kind of following day or the following workout, with the incline curl, is that sort of an incline bench curl where they're leaning backwards, or is that a preacher curl where they're leaning forwards?
I believe that would have been an incline bench curl.
Yeah. And in terms of the pulley exercise for the triceps, again, presumably a standing
I
press down.
assume it. Yes, I assume so. That was
Yeah.
generally what was
Yeah.
available at that time.
Yeah. Yeah. So we can't be
Even Steve Reeves was using
confident.
that exercise about
Okay.
5 to 10 years earlier. Yeah,
So we can't be really confident about exactly what the exercise selections were here, but we can kind of be, sort of
we can make some
reasonable.
assumptions.
Yeah, we can create some assumptions. So in that respect, then, I think generally there's some good exercise selection here, but I also think there's a bit of redundancy. I think there would have been some better choices, and I think that's interesting because often when we look at silver era programs, the exercise selection is often very intelligently or intuitively put together. And I think there's a little bit of intuition lost here, even though generally it's good. I mean, don't get me wrong. If somebody were to put a kind of exercise selection together like this for an upper lower, it's not horrible. But um, when I look at it, and just to be clear, there's some stuff in here that I really like. So, I like the fact that we've got some hamstrings work, which we
Yeah,
don't
you would
tend
like
to
that.
get.
Yeah.
We don't tend to get in many of the silver era programs. I like the fact that if our assumptions are correct, I like the fact that we've got some different planes of motion for back work, that we've got transverse and probably sagittal. I don't like the fact that it's not frontal plane, but at least we have got, a couple of different planes of motion, which means that we are training different parts of the back. I'm not a fan of the press behind the neck plus the lateral raise, especially with the kind of volumes that he's pushing here. So, honestly, with an upper lower split, I would say that 5 sets for a muscle group is pretty toppy. I think that's about as far as you can go. So if you're doing 8 sets, I think that's way off the top end. So the fact that you've got
Do
5
you think
press
though that those five,
athletically.
so the behind the neck with sets of five,
Sure, if you're doing like the first
presumably,
2 sets as a warm up, then maybe you're kind
yeah,
of pulling back, and then okay, then it starts to make a little bit more sense because then you've kind of got, as you were pointing out at the beginning, you've got this multi-joint exercise to start with, followed by a single joint exercise afterwards, and you may be kind of getting 5 whole sets with the unilateral allowing you to maintain high levels of recruitment all the way to the end of those 5 sets. So yeah, no, in the way that you're describing, I think that probably works, but on the other hand, if that's not the way it's done, then it won't work because it'll be too much volume.
and it's interesting even just observing that all of those exercises he's doing 5 sets on, they're the ones he's doing 5 repetitions on. When he's doing
Sure,
10 repetitions, he's doing fewer sets.
sure. So yeah, so you can make the case that depending on how this is being done, it could work. I'm just pointing out that if
Mm.
somebody read this and went off and did it as written without thinking about those assumptions behind the scenes, it's probably going to be too much volume.
So workout A, the lower plus back. So obviously we don't have a leg extension, and part of that is probably equipment availability. So we can
Most likely,
probably give a
most
concession
likely,
there.
most
We
likely.
do have a leg raise, so technically speaking, we are getting some hip flexor work,
True.
technically rec fem work. So for the quads, I mean, really
So
beyond a squat.
if you're asking me what's missing or what I would do differently, then
Yeah.
I think frontal plane back work is the thing that's missing,
Which tends to be missing in almost all the silver era plans.
which tends to be missing in all the silver era plans. So again, historically, contextually is not surprising, which is
No.
why I said, as a program, I don't dislike this program. I'm just pointing out that
Mm.
I think there's a little bit of redundancy in a couple of places, depending on how you chop it up, depending on how you think it's been done.
And that behind the neck and then going into the dumbbell lateral raise,
Mm.
I don't know if you made this point or not, but obviously the behind the neck, you are getting a good amount of middle delt stimulus, and then the lateral raise, obviously you're kind of doubling up a little bit. Now, as you pointed out, by going into that lateral raise, you're kind of maintaining that
Yeah,
stimulus. But
yeah.
if you were to add a second shoulder exercise, would it even make any more sense to do one that was more anterior delt? Like obviously the behind the neck is kind of fairly even between both anyway, no?
Yeah, yeah, pretty much. The problem is the lateral raise with dumbbells is starting to get to that point as well. People don't realize that, but
Yeah.
the most difficult part of a lateral raise with a dumbbell is the top of the range of motion, which is again going to start including your anterior delt quite a lot.
Mm,
So honestly, they're not that different really.
mm,
It's just that you got higher recruitment in
yeah.
the lateral raise. Um, Again, that is depending on the person's leverages and where they find the exercise most
Mhm.
difficult and all the rest of it. So if somebody's really struggling to lock out on their press behind the neck, then it really becomes much more of an anterior delt exercise.
So workout one, there's not a huge amount of adjusting there required. You're a bit skeptical about some of these volumes being recoverable volumes, and obviously you've mentioned
Yeah,
the frontal plane for the back.
yeah.
Workout two,
So workout two, you've got exactly the same thing going on with the bench press and the fly that you've got going on with the press behind the
with the
neck and the
shoulders.
lateral raise.
Yeah,
Exactly the same thing.
exactly.
To the extent that you're modeling what he's doing correctly, then it works because, your first couple of sets of the 5x5 are kind of warm ups and again, the heavier load makes it less fatiguing. So you
Mhm,
kind of get some solid sets with your bench press followed by some unilateral stuff with the fly, and you end up with some really good pec stimulus, assuming that you're using the same transverse plane in both cases, which you probably are. So exactly the same situation is going on. Um, it looks like he's following the same model for the curl and the incline curl, but because we don't really know what those exercises look like, because the
yeah.
variations aren't clear, it's tricky to know what he's really doing here. Um, Honestly, to me, it looks like the curl is probably a standing barbell curl, which is kind of balanced between all of the different elbow flexors, and then the incline curl probably depending on how it's done and, kind of what the limiting factor is, could end up being similar or it could end up being a little bit different. I mean, I don't feel that to me, they're not the best two curl variations if you want to get either the same thing that's going on with the bench press and the fly, which is not really possible with a single joint exercise anyway,
Mm,
or if you want to actually target different parts of the elbow flexor, that's not the way I would do it. So
mm.
for me, curls don't really work that well here. I mean, it's just an elbow flexor, pair of elbow flexor exercises. There's nothing wrong with it. But honestly, I would probably choose two different ones if I was doing that.
Even doing a concentration curl would have made more sense than the
Exactly,
incline.
exactly. That would have kept the same pattern that
Yeah.
he's doing with the bench press plus fly or the behind the neck press plus lateral raise because you're going from a bigger muscle mass to a less muscle mass exercise, keeping recruitment high.
So can I push on that point? So if we use the example of the bench, so he's done 5 sets of 5, presumably 1 or 2 warm-up sets included there, and then he's gone into a dumbbell fly. So, and you've made the point there that, look, both are working similar parts of the chest, most likely, depending on the person. Now, if he were to have just done, and we would have a recovery issue here, I understand, but if he had just done 8 sets of the bench, he would have theoretically gotten less of a stimulus for his chest than by actually doing the 5 sets of bench and then doing the fly instead of continuing on with more sets of the bench. Yeah.
So just to be clear, what you're saying is that we're comparing 8 sets of bench
Hmm.
with 5 sets of bench plus 3 sets of flies.
Yep.
And by doing the 3 sets of flies at the end, we're switching from a multi-joint exercise to a single joint exercise and therefore allowing recruitment to stay higher. And the reason for that is because um, the number of muscles that are involved in exercise affects the total amount of motor unit recruitment signal you need to create in the brain. And the total amount of motor unit recruitment signal we create in the brain, which you can call neural drive or central motor command or whatever you want to call it, essentially produces perceptions of effort. It's called the sensation of innovation. And that sensation of innovation is obviously going to be related to the number of places you've got to send recruitment. If you've got fewer places, you have smaller sensation of innovation, you reach your maximum tolerable perception of effort at a higher level of recruitment on an individual muscle basis. It's very, very straightforward stuff. So ultimately, it's making use of that in multiple places in this program, which is, it's interesting phenomenon. It's exactly what we talked about. Was it last week or the week before?
Yeah. Last week with Dorian's plan.
Range plan. Yeah, exactly.
It's it's really interesting to actually conceptualize because it makes one think, why would someone do a multi-set plan that is doing 3, 4 sets of a multi-joint exercise? If you want to do the multi-joint exercise, sure, do your 2 sets or whatever, but why would one not finish with even a single set of a single joint exercise afterwards? Like it just there's not a compelling reason to just add more sets on a multi joint exercise.
There's definitely very rapid diminishing returns, as we know from the meta-analyses with dose responses that we've got. So you start to creep up into the higher numbers of sets, and really each extra set is doing minimal extra benefit. And so finding a way to increase recruitment for the muscle you're actually interested in, I think, is a really good plan.
So let me ask one more question here then, because I actually think people will be confused by this. So his bench, he was doing sets of 5. And 5 has sort of become like the magic, repetition number where it's like, hey, this is where there's not really any, wasted work. The sort of work to stimulus or stimulus to fatigue ratio is as optimal as you can get. And yet he's gone to then doing flies with sets of 10, and someone will look at that and be like, well, hang on, 5 of those reps are useless, and
But he's
that's just
probably
extra
maxing the
fatigue.
machine out there.
Well, I know. I mean, that's the thing when I see people do plans with, everything is a set of 5. It's like, well, how would you even feasibly do that? But in this situation, is it better to stick with a set of 5 on a multi-joint exercise or to do a set of 10 on a single joint exercise? I would feel it's probably better to go to that set of 10 with a single joint, no?
I honestly, I think this is a practical consideration. I mean, this is almost certainly people who are just maxing machines out. I don't think that this is a decision that was made for any
No,
physiological
but in the
or
sense that if he kept with the bench and did another set of 5 on the bench compared to going to the fly and doing a set of 10, because people might look at that and be like, well, that set of 10 was too much
no
fatigue. You should have just stuck with that.
10 is not 10 is still inside the range of repetitions that causes increases in recruitment after training. So this is the thing that you need to do. You need to look at what is the data that we have available that tells us what's happening. If I can do a set of 10 and that increases motor unit recruitment levels as an adaptation, that tells me my recruitment levels are pretty high at the end of the set. So I think that 10 is fine. Really, it's creeping up towards 15. 12 to 15 is where you start to lose the ability to trigger the adaptation in recruitment after training. And that's where you've got other sensations going on to such a high degree that you're not really capable of reaching max recruitment at task failure.
That would be different if you were doing maximum velocity concentrics, no?
Well, yeah, but then you trigger recruitment increases on the first rep. So,
Okay. Is anything else to say on that day? The
so
triceps.
yeah, so we've argued about the curl variations, and I would probably have a similar argument about the kind of triceps kind of
Yeah.
exercises. I'd be like, what are we doing that's really that different? I mean, there are some differences there. I think that we can see if the French press is behind the neck, then yeah, maybe you're getting some more medial and lateral triceps. The pulley is the standing push down, maybe you get some more long head. So yeah, that's not as bad, I think, as the two curl
The
variations.
biceps, yeah.
Um, you know, yeah.
It is
It's
funny though,
fine.
because obviously they must know, I assume, and not just John McCallum, but other people who wrote plans in a similar format, must have had some idea of what they were doing by doing the multi-joint into the single joint,
No,
the bench
no,
into the fly. But then when they get to a single joint
they
muscle,
don't switch to unilateral. Yeah,
they
they don't.
didn't follow the thought pattern. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
So they
yeah,
got stumped. So they haven't
yeah.
really sort of logically thought about what it is that they were programming, even though they kind of knew what they were doing.
Yeah. So, but in terms of exercise selection overall, you know, there's definitely some smaller gaps. I mean, I said for the first workout that I thought the major omission was the frontal plane pulling exercise, but I could have easily also argued that the hamstrings isn't really fully kind of trained by just doing a stiff leg deadlift. I mean,
Which
but,
again would be difficult
but
with
then
the equipment.
it's the equipment availability. As regards the second day, the when the approach that's been taken to training the pecs, for example, is very like we're just going to train everything with one exercise or one plane of motion. You they could have gone down a route of doing a little bit of variety there. But again, is that equipment related? Because you could train more clavicular pec by doing some more close grip stuff. But then you'd be like, well, okay, but how do I balance that out with more sternal and costal pec? And then you need some cables to play around with. And if that's not available, which it may not have been, then you're kind of a bit stuck. So you kind of see where they end up because you kind of eliminate all
Yeah.
the other possibilities.
You could even run into some issues there with the shoulder work on the other day as well then, because presumably this bench is probably done with a fairly wide grip. So limiting for most people the amount of shoulder involvement. And had they done, closer grip, incline, whatever, then maybe you'd run into some issues.
Yeah. So, again, like with Silver Era programs, you can kind of, when you start sort of removing the things that we would choose because the equipment isn't
Yeah.
available, then you kind of start to understand how they put the routine together the way they did, and why they did it. And
Yep.
then, as I say, as we've been talking about, when you start to identify some of the approaches that they're taking with the heavy multi-joint followed by the slightly
Yeah.
lighter sort of single joint, then there's some really interesting stuff here, and it's really well put together.
Yeah.
It's just a few exercise selection omissions, a couple of areas here and there that I think the volume is a bit toppy, and then really just like something that we've seen many times before. I don't know if you highlighted as you went through, but with the calf raise exercise, they're doing 5 sets of 30, which is a little bit strange but something that we see a lot, in other programs. People just seem to do high reps
In
for calf.
almost all the plans, I barely recall. I think maybe Mensa was the only plan we've looked at where it was lower repetitions for calves,
Yeah,
and he was less limited by equipment at that point. And I was actually looking at one of Reg Park's bodybuilding courses today, and it was all sets of 5, and in cars were, I think, sets of 25 or 30.
yeah,
And the instruction was get your training partner to jump on your back and you do your sets of 25. And it would be so hard to convince me otherwise that this is not just purely down to, again, accessibility, what they've got access to, having body weight, someone on your back. You can't how could you possibly do a set of 5 weighted calf raises back then?
yeah. No, it's definitely indicative of a practical limitation. But I just want to highlight why a kind of 30 rep set is still feasible. I think
Mm.
volume of 5 sets of that is too high, because I think as you do more high rep stuff, you have to dial back the number of sets. But then, okay, maybe calves can recover slightly better. But
Well,
again,
again, if they were limited, if they can't add more weight than what they can add, right? If they can add the weight of
sure,
your training partner and
sure,
that's it,
sure,
at a
sure.
certain point, that 30 isn't a max set of 30.
No,
So
sure.
is it just that they're reducing the time between sets so that
Yeah,
hopefully
maybe.
by the time you get to
By the
set
time they
5,
get to, yeah, so it's not really one set to failure. You're probably only getting one set to failure at the very
yeah,
end. Yeah, I can see that. Just to be clear for people who are kind of saying, well, how do different rep ranges work? Because I've seen this question a few times, and I just want to use the opportunity to answer it. Basically, when we are doing a set to failure, then multiple fatigue mechanisms are working. Now, if we have a load or a muscle force which is at least 30% of our maximum force, or 30% of 1 rep max, which kind of a 30 rep max is going to be in that zone. Generally a little bit more than that. So that's enough to be at that threshold. So if you're creating at least that level of whole muscle force, then the whole muscle force, now we're not talking about single fiber tension here, not talking about mechanical tension, we're talking about whole muscle force. The whole muscle force is enough to squeeze the veins closed while you're doing the concentric contraction. So you get what's called vascular occlusion, and that traps blood inside the muscle. If you drop below that force level, so if you're like doing 100 rep sets to failure, then you drop below that by quite a long way, actually. And as a result, each muscular contraction in the concentric phase is no longer occluding the blood flow. So blood flow comes straight out of the muscle in the concentric phase. That's the difference between kind of the 30% of 1 rep max and below. So that's why when you look at, and this is a conversation I actually had with Stuart Phillips probably about 20 years ago. Now, the interesting thing is that, and he pointed out to me, he made a very the very valid point a long time ago. He said to me, we're choosing these percentages of 1 rep max when we use 30% of 1 rep max in our training studies that he was doing with light loads versus moderate loads. We're choosing them because it allows occlusion of blood flow. We're deliberately choosing that because we know that that happens. And that's really, really important, because if you drop below that level of whole muscle force, blood doesn't occlude vascular occlusion doesn't happen, blood doesn't stay in the muscle, blood comes straight out and takes all the metabolites with it. So the fundamental difference between something like a 30 rep max set and a 100 rep max set is that you get metabolite accumulation happening in your 30 rep max, but you don't get it happening in your 100 rep max. And that changes the way that the muscle fibers experience the end of the set. So if you're slowing to muscular failure in a 30 rep set and you're slowing to muscular failure in a 100 rep set, the slowing to failure in the 30 rep max set is happening in large part because of the metabolite accumulation, which doesn't negatively affect mechanical tension. Metabolites permit cross bridges to form; they just slow the formation rate down. In contrast, if I get to muscular failure with a 100 rep max set, I cannot do that because of metabolites, and I have to do it locally because of calcium ion related fatigue. Calcium ions stop cross bridges from happening. That stops mechanical tension. That stops you from actually triggering hypertrophy. So this is why when Brad Schoenfeld did his really famous study, I don't think he was the lead author. I apologize to the fact that I can't remember the lead author's name, but he was involved in this study where they compared, I think it was 4 different loads. And essentially every single load, apart from the load that went below 30% of 1 max, I think they had 40% and 20%. 40% and 60% and 80% all created exactly the same hypertrophy. 20% creates pretty much none in comparison. And the reason for that is because you're actually not getting mechanical tension on the muscle fibers at muscular failure in that scenario, because calcium ion-related fatigue is your only available local fatigue mechanism. Metabolites obviously aren't there because they can't be trapped. So fundamentally, it's really important when you look at these kind of programs and you see sets of like 30 reps, you're like, okay, not ideal, not perfect like we were describing, but fundamentally possible. When you look at the program, and we were arguing a little bit about this before we got on the podcast today, and I was saying, and you were saying to me, well, nobody trains like this. And I'm like, well, I actually do see powerlifting programs where people do these back offsets of hundreds of reps of, kind of elastic band press downs after they've done their bench pressing workouts. I'm like, that is not doing anything. Now I can argue in a separate, maybe on the high performance physiology podcast, I can argue about why that doesn't do anything for tendons or ligaments or anything like that. But for here, it's not doing anything for hypertrophy because it can't. It can't actually allow mechanical tension to be experienced by the working fibers at muscular failure because you haven't got any metabolites. So
and obviously, spinal and supraspinal CNS fatigue levels are going to be high in that very high rep set as well. So, do you know?
Totally. I'm just contrasting the 2 local fatigue mechanism groups here.
Yeah. No, I was purely just thinking from a damage perspective. It'd be interesting, like a set of 30 to failure compared to a set, because a set of 30, obviously a set of 100 is going to have more spinal CNS fatigue and supraspinal CNS fatigue than a set of 30.
CNS fatigue's just increased. I mean, like, people, I think, don't appreciate, because they've been brainwashed by fitness influencers over the decades shouting that, heavy loads fry your CNS or whatever nonsense they're talking about. Fatigue physiologists know without a shadow of a doubt that increasing exercise duration is associated with increasing central nervous system fatigue proportion of the total fatigue. So, like, if you look at long distance kind of aerobic exercise, 80% plus of the total fatigue that they're experiencing is in the CNS. And the opposite, it's like the exact opposite of what you get in strength training.
So how would the muscle damage from a set of, say, 100 compared to the muscle damage from a set of, say, 30?
Honestly, I think it would be greater. How much greater is difficult to say, because as you rightly point out, the CNS fatigue mechanisms are starting to stop you from really applying so much calcium ion accumulation to the fibers that you're working. But equally, you've got no metabolites to help you either. So I think it might be twice as bad. I don't know. I think it is meaningfully worse. I mean, the the Farrow study, I believe the name is Farrow, the lead author, where they actually compared quite high reps with even higher reps. And the higher reps was really, really quite a lot worse in terms of post-workout fatigue. So I think that would be the study. I forget the exact details of the numbers of reps they used, but that would be the place I would start with. So I think it does create a meaningfully worse effect in terms of calcium-related fatigue and post-workout fatigue, but the exact ratio I don't really have
Sure.
a handle on.
So this plan, twice a week, and he was doing, 5, even 8 sets per muscle, but obviously some of those sets were low repetitions and
I
some were
think
potentially warm up.
the way that you're modeling it makes it doable. I
Yeah,
do, because 5
yeah.
sets for me is the upper limit on training a muscle group twice a week. 5 sets per workout, to be clear.
Now, theoretically, he could have done single sets, and that still would have worked. It still would have produced hypertrophy,
Net
even
hypertrophy across the week,
even in some of the some of the muscles that were being trained with just a single exercise, it still would have been enough, let alone the ones where he was using 2 exercises. So I suspect this is one reason why it's easy enough to find plans when we go back to the silver era and early golden era, where people were training a muscle twice a week or even training full body twice a week. But I simply cannot find plans where they were training at least full body once a week, because it did become so much more challenging. So let's talk about that. Why is it so much more challenging to write an effective program once a week than even just twice a week?
So essentially, when we talk about hypertrophy measured or hypertrophy stimulus, or the hypertrophy magnitude that we experience across a 7-day period a week, then what we're saying is that there are going to be some stimuli during the week of whatever workouts we're doing, and then when we leave the period of time in which we are processing that stimulus, which I call the hypertrophy stimulus period because I'm not good at making up names, but basically you kind of have a period of time that you're processing the hypertrophy stimulus. So you trigger it in the workout and then you process it afterwards. And then you leave that period of time. Now, muscle fibers are always either growing or shrinking. There's no such thing as a muscle fiber just sitting in stasis, because that would require it to have some kind of molecular clock that waits kind of a period of time before it starts atrophying. I mean, that's just nonsense. It doesn't happen. So the fiber experiences stimulus and it grows while it's experiencing that stimulus. It grows for a period of time after it has experienced that stimulus. And when it's finished growing, it then is like waiting for the next stimulus. And while it's doing that, it's starting to shrink. And that's really, kind of how fibers operate. So if you kind of got say a 2-day period of time, which is the kind of standard number of days that most researchers are working with when they're thinking about this, I'm not going to argue the exact period of time. Basically, you've got maybe a 48-hour window after your workout when you experience that stimulus. Then if you go another 5 days, if you're talking about a whole week period, if you go another 5 days without any training stimulus, then you're actually losing muscle fiber size in that 5-day period. And we can see that really clearly from a group of studies called the maintenance literature. If you go to look at the maintenance literature, what you find is a whole bunch of studies, and most of them have used either 3 or 4 sets, single workouts each week, and you essentially don't experience any growth net across the training program. And some of those training programs have been 6 months long. So people have done 6 months of training and they've done 3 sets once per week or 4 sets once per week. And at the end of the 6-month period, they're no bigger than they were at the beginning. And that's telling us that the sort of amount of growth that is experienced by each individual workout is lost in the following 5-day period before the next workout. That's just how it works. There's no real way to argue against that, because somebody would go, oh, well, 3 sets, in a workout isn't enough to stimulate hypertrophy. And I'm like, well, it is, because I can actually do single sets twice a week and get hypertrophy. I've got studies showing that. So that's nonsense. So the only way to explain the maintenance studies is to assume that you're getting atrophy inside each training week that equals the 3-set hypertrophy that you get, or 4-set hypertrophy you get on one day. I've never seen anybody really criticize those studies, and I've never seen anybody come up with an alternative explanation for them. And so what you get is the internet simply ignoring them. And so people just simply don't talk about it, because the only explanation is the one that I'm giving. So that gives us a really clear picture of how that is then working over each training week. The other side of that is then, okay, well, that is telling us that if we want to do a training program in which we're only training a muscle once per week, or actually only doing one gym visit once per week, which is the introduction that we gave, at the start, then actually you have to do probably at least 4, if not 5 sets per muscle fiber that you're interested in training. And that's where it gets really annoying, because you're like, well, if I've got to do 5 sets of the exact same exercise, or, maybe you could argue that you could use the same kind of technique that we've been describing in this program and this program as well, where you could do one multi-joint exercise and then essentially an identical single joint exercise afterwards, but then you'd lose the benefits of the other muscles that the multi-joint exercise was training. You're actually stuck with 5 sets per exercise, and not many people want to do more than probably 20 sets total per workout. I mean, that's toppy. I mean, I've had people get really aggravated with me when I've said 20 sets is doable, and I don't like doing it. I think 12 is much more sensible place to kind of pitch myself, but people can go up to 20, and you've got people doing 20 in your groups, so it's totally doable. But that's only 4 exercises. So the limitation, so this is really the two sides of the problem. The one side of the problem is that we've got this atrophy happening, which means we've got to push workout volumes really high. And the implication of that is that then we're limited in the number of exercises that we can do. And so we end up being very constrained in terms of the type of program that will actually work, or the type of exercise workout that will actually work in the context of that type of program.
So you've landed on 5 sets because some of the maintenance literature showed that 4 sets was maintenance.
Still maintenance.
So some of it did show that 3 sets was maintenance. So you could argue at 4 sets, maybe you're going to get net hypertrophy, maybe you won't. So you're saying, hey, let's go with 5 sets because we're fairly confident that that's going to give you net hypertrophy.
Exactly. So that's why in my weekly net stimulus model, I say to people, you can either choose 3 as your assumption for maintenance or 4 as your assumption for maintenance, whichever one you think is more likely. But you can't choose anything less than that. So you can't say 2 is maintenance, because it's not.
Now, how much do you think there's individual variance in that? We've talked about, the effect of dieting and stress on muscle protein breakdown. Presumably that would come into play to an extent.
So this is a huge can of worms, but basically we did an episode, and this is me remembering something that we talked about in the past. I'd like to have this put on my record, actually. I've remembered something that we talked about. I actually had people commenting on the fact that I'm starting to forget stuff a lot now. But I remember that we talked about how muscle fiber atrophy works and whether it differs between type 2 and type 1 muscle fibers. And I explained that if you look at the literature, there's some really good data suggesting that the only thing that affects the rate of atrophy of a muscle fiber is its starting size, not whether it's a fast twitch or a slow twitch fiber. So arguably, we would find that the more advanced somebody gets, the faster they are going to experience atrophy within a training week. So I would say that you're more likely to see higher maintenance volumes being required in more advanced. So I don't actually like the word advanced. I don't like the phrase advanced lifter. I prefer to talk about muscles being well developed. I've made this point loads of times before, and people just ignore me because they want to call themselves advanced or intermediate, whatever. They want to label to describe themselves. I'm like, you can't really do that. Like, my lats are definitely in the category of advanced muscle group by anybody's kind of standards who, isn't using anabolics. But my calves are absolutely not. They're really, really not. So, it's like muscles are advanced or intermediate, or it just depends on the state that they're in, the proximity to their maximum capable growth in a natural state. So yeah, I think really it's like, how fast you like to see atrophy in these muscle fibers. Well, how big are they? If they're really big, then you can see faster atrophy. I mean, like I'm going to put some data together to illustrate this point again. I've made this point many times before, but people still seem to think that the more advanced they get, the longer they can hang on to muscle for, and it's exactly the opposite. Rates of atrophy are always faster at the immediate termination point of a training program. You can look at this in the detraining literature. You can see this happening. There's a exponential decay of muscle mass immediately after stopping the training program, and then you start to see a slow down of the loss later on. You can see this in the atrophy literature. So some really nice data showing that you do a couple of weeks of immobilization or bed rest or whatever, and almost all of the losses happen in the first week. So people who, I mean, this goes back to the influencers who, kind of, they stare at the camera really intensely and say, muscle loss happens really, really slowly. I'm like, no, it doesn't. It happens really quickly. So, and almost all of that loss is going to happen in the first kind of couple of days and weeks of stopping whatever it was you were doing that was creating the growth in the first place. So I think that you're going to see an effect whereby the more advanced the muscle is, the faster their rate of atrophy is going to be. So yeah, I would say that if anything, a once per week program is going to be probably impossible for a advanced lifter to make progress on. An advanced muscle to make progress on, whereas an intermediate or a beginner is probably going to be okay to make that work.
So we've landed on needing probably 5 sets per muscle. And I think you made the point that you could follow a similar format to what we've talked about today, where you had multiple exercises and you were doing fewer sets and whatever.
But again, you're going to lose the ability to then grow the kind of the other muscles that aren't worked by the single joint exercise.
Exactly. So then you would need more total sets. And also, I mean, this for me would be one situation where I would prefer to just do more sets of the same exercise, because in this situation, efficiency is going to be so important.
Yeah.
And even the small amount of time it might take to set up a new exercise, it's just not going to be worth it, in my opinion, when we are talking 20, 30 sets that's required in this single workout.
Yeah. So interestingly, when I had this question on Instagram basically, and I tagged you because I was like, I think we should answer this, and you'd already got an answer pre-prepared. That was, but by the time I saw your story with the answer in, I'd already kind of presented my kind of solution, and the solution was basically almost identical to yours, with one tiny difference. So I said basically, a press, I didn't specify because I think everyone's got their own preferences. A pull, and again, I didn't specify, but for me, that would probably be a shallow incline bench press, probably scapular plane, and then just for comfort, really, because if I'm doing 5 sets, I don't really want to have something that's uncomfortable. And then I'd probably do a frontal plane kind of pull down. That would be probably my personal preferences. And then, and that's not just preferences regarding comfort. I guess it's also some preferences regarding aesthetics. So I would probably prefer to have a press that was more delt focused rather than pec focused, just personal aesthetic preferences. And then in terms of lower body, I'd had a leg press and a stiff leg deadlift. And I was like, that feels to me like it gets as much coverage as I can possibly get for lower body, without spending hours doing, kind of setup for squats and things like that. People who find stiff legs take a long time to set up for, fine, then, they could do something else. But I've never really found stiff legs take a huge amount of time to set up for. So that would be my set of preferences. And the stiff leg gets me, kind of a little bit of sort of stabilizer muscles all over the place, plus obviously the hamstrings, maybe some adductor magnus glutes as well. Maybe I'm crossing over a little bit between the leg press and the stiff leg there. Maybe that's not ideal, but that was kind of my solution. So describe your solution to us.
Well, my solution was effectively the same as yours, but I had selected a leg curl, a seated leg curl, instead of the stiff leg deadlift. I can't remember now if I gave a leg press or a squat. I think perhaps I gave a hack squat.
I think you had a hack squat instead of the leg press, and I think, which is interesting because I think you're kind of, that is
kind of did the opposite in a sense with your lower body, no?
So yeah, I mean, this probably deserves a little bit more time than we're going to give it, but the differences between a hack squat and a leg press are probably a little bit more subtle than we're giving them credit for. But there's definitely something interesting that's going on there. If people want to do a kind of biomechanical analysis and tell us what they think, they're welcome to. But I think that's not something I've seen a lot of data on, so it's difficult to be too precise. But I think, you're probably, going down the route of less extraneous muscles, aren't you? With your hack squat and your leg curl, they're quite targeted in comparison.
In comparison to your stiff leg deadlift, yeah. And I mean, for me, the reason I didn't go with a stiff leg deadlift was purely setup time.
Okay.
And yeah, so, if by the time you're doing, if you have, I guess it does come down to the strength of the lifter. If someone just needs one plate, it's quick to set up, it's easy. If someone's using more weight, which arguably not many advanced lifters or people
Well,
with
yeah,
advanced
that's it.
hamstrings will be doing.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I've just always found stiff legs to be fairly comfortable, and so I've never really it's like I used to take 20, 25 minutes to get to a point where I could squat. That for me was the one that just chewed up
Mm.
time at the gym. Whereas stiff leg, I can walk across to a barbell and just grip and rip, and it just feels so. I'm a built deadlifter rather than a squatter, so it feels very comfortable for me to do that, especially on stiff leg, where it's just pure hip hinge, which is what
Mm.
my whatever it is, the word. I mean, as I get older, I forget words, I forget everything. Um, yeah, just the way that my biomechanics works. So, yeah, maybe other people would find that would take too long to set up for. So,
I do, yeah, I do think it comes down to the individual. So for what it's worth, the plan that you saw of mine, that was the one in my group for beginners. And I also don't particularly do much stiff leg or rack pulling with beginners. I'll do some hip hinging, but a stiff leg deadlift, I would normally wait until someone's maybe a little bit more intermediate. So that's partly why I chose that exercise selection. But I did think about it then so I've got like an intermediate version of this sort of template as well. And that's where I was trying to target a little bit more of some of the, I guess, the two joint muscles that will be missing in a abbreviated plan like what we've talked
well,
about just now.
that's where I think we need to go with this next to help people understand that this is, even though this is a solution, it is a long way away from being a ideal way of training because
Yeah.
you're missing a lot by doing this. I mean, this is really bare bones stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, this is really, really bare bones. Because if you could literally go, as I made this point on my stories, if you could literally go from, doing that program once per week to doing a workout twice per week, you could drop everything down to single sets.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
You
And
know,
that's the point I was making at the start
mad.
about
It's
every 5 days.
absolutely mad.
Even if you could train every 5 days, you could do 1 or 2 sets. One set probably going to be maintenance, arguably. 2 sets is going to be net growth, no? So you could literally more than halve the volume and get
And
similar.
suddenly you can now do your kind of single joint stuff. You can do your rec fem work. You can do, kind of a couple of different exercises for presses and pulls. You can do some direct arm work. You can do some glute work. You can do some calf raises. Suddenly you've got the ability to now do full body
Yeah.
A,
Yeah.
twice a
Yeah.
week. And the program is now awesome because long term, you're going to make great
Yeah.
growth across the whole body. This program that we're describing here is like survival level strength training.
Yeah.
It's like, it's the absolute bare minimum just for like anything. It's like,
Yeah.
this is just going to get you like from 0 to 1, if you like.
Yeah. Yeah. I've
It's
said
not,
this before. I maintain having like training every 5 days, every 4 or 5 days is such a hack for if you're traveling, if there's something come up where you just can't get into the gym more regularly, the difference that couple of days makes compared to once a week, it will just make your life so much easier in what that plan in the gym can actually look like. Like I think people are too wed to the idea of a calendar week. Oh, I need to do 2 sessions a week or how many sessions a week. No, it's okay.
well,
If you do,
to be fair, the context that this was argued to me and or asked of me is definitely something that people are going to be wed to a calendar week because
yeah, if it's work
it's a
related,
work
sure. But if it's traveling,
constraint.
that's my recommendation to clients who are traveling is always,
Yeah, no,
can
I
you get
agree.
into the gym every
Yeah,
5 days?
yeah, no, that's a valid one. I think if people are traveling, then it's like just look in your calendar and try and find a place every 5 days. That makes a lot more sense. And also that has the benefit that they can keep their existing exercise selection. So
Yeah.
just this is an important point. So there's two contexts where this question can come up. In the first context, the one that I've seen it in recently, which is what we're responding to today, is this is somebody who's like, this is the format of my life for the next, couple of months or even a year or whatever. So I need a program that I can kind of work with for that entire period of time. Okay, fine. Well, then there's no point in putting extra exercises in from time to time, because whatever you get from those extra exercises is going to go away. In contrast, the context that you just raised is different, because somebody will have been maybe doing some kind of program with a lot more exercises in, and whether that's full body A or whether it's full body AB, doesn't really matter. The point is that they are getting some benefit, or have had some benefit from all of those exercises, and they've kept it for some period of time. Now they go in the gym. If you were to go from that type program to this, what we've talked about today, with just 4 exercises, that would be a big down step from anything you've been doing previously, because you would now lose any fiber growth that you've had in the fibers you're now not training. So specifically stuff like rec fem, kind of maybe some gastroc work, long head of the triceps, various bits and pieces that maybe you're not training very effectively. In contrast, if you literally do that every 5-day workout, you can just go to your program as it stands. You can pick out every single exercise that you're doing and try and do as much of those in a single session with single sets. And that's it. That's the way you would approach that problem, I think.
Yeah, exactly right. If you're doing an AB full body, each workout's 6 exercises, maybe you're doing 2 sets of each, well, then you would just combine them, and then you do a single set, 12 exercises, and maybe 5 days. Now, let's say that first scenario. So this is your life. You're not doing a normal plan outside of this. This is the plan you're following. If someone wanted to maybe target more of their body than what we've just outlined with those 4 exercises, or I guess I guess in that sense, like if they want to really make the most of this possible once per week plan, are there any other creative ways you can think about doing this? So there's a couple that came to mind for me, and one, what you're sort of smirking a little bit. What are you laughing
Well,
at?
yeah, I mean, this my brain just goes, what? Why would I want? Why would I want to think about that?
Well, one I thought of was clusters. So if we're saying you need about 5 sets of stimulating, or 5 sets of stimulus, let's say, then you could achieve that doing cluster sets. And so we could equate that maybe to about 20.
I think that practically you would end up in a similar place in terms of time, effort, and setup if you went down the cluster route to if you just did 5 sets of moderate loads to failure. So if you go in the gym and you do 5 sets of 8 to 10 to failure with a couple of minutes rest, I think that to do that same volume stimulating reps with clusters, I think you would probably have to use heavy loads, because if you don't use heavy loads with clusters, you burn an enormous amount of time getting the fatigue necessary to get into your stimulating rep zone. And that means you're now going to have to warm up to the point where you're doing 5 rep maxes with stuff like hack squat and leg press and stiff leg deadlift and stuff like that. And that's territory that's going to take you time to get to. So I think you're going to end up in more or less the same place with those 2 things. But I agree with you, it's totally doable. I'm just not sure it's better.
I think for upper body, I think it could be potentially a little bit more viable. I agree, if you're doing a leg press, a hack squat, something like that, it's probably not going to... I mean, even for me personally, I actually quite like doing it for pendulum squat, but I can see what you're saying. But if you're doing something like a shoulder press machine or something like that, it's arguably going to be 2 sets to warm up.
No, you can probably make that happen.
Yeah, I don't think it'll save you stacks of time, but I do wonder whether, given the volume of that workout, whether that would maybe help mitigate some of the supraspinal CNS fatigue and maybe just make the workout as a whole a little bit more effective.
Yeah, although again, the exercises that you would need it in order to see that meaningful reduction in supraspinal CNS would be the lower body ones, because they're the ones that
true.
create more of the kind of cardiovascular sensation. So,
well, in the plan that I gave, so I would do that with a lying leg curl. Then, if I was going to do this clusters, I wouldn't do it with a seated leg curl. But if it was a lying leg curl, I would say a pendulum squat, an overhead press machine, or would be a good back exercise to do it on. Even a lat pull down honestly works pretty well. I know you're not a fan of classes on that pull down.
Well, it's just like, how would I do that? I'm just like, I'm kind of the machine I've got in the gym at the moment. I'm maxing it out doing 8s. So
in frontal plane?
Yeah. So
okay. So maybe it's not going to work for you.
I think that's the issue that we've got with a lot of machine exercises. And I've seen this with powerlifters before. They've said to me they just max out the the pulling machines in the
Yeah.
gym by a long way. So I think that's just how it is. But yeah, we are talking about an intermediate level lifter here, so it probably isn't an
May not
issue.
be the
But
same issue. Yeah.
yeah.
Now, the other way that I would program this, and what I have done in my group, is try to do exercises at the same station. And there's always going to be a bit of a trade-off here. So, obviously in this example of training once a week, there's going to be some limitations or some sort of, I guess, compromises we're going to need to make. But if I was trying to maximize kind of total musculature I could actually train in that session, for me personally, I would probably just grab a bench and some dumbbells. And I'd spend a lot of time just at a bench with dumbbells. And that way, at least we can get some triceps long head work in. We can get some direct arm work in. We can do a chest exercise there. We can do back exercise. Okay, lower body, probably not so much, but we can actually even do more of like a kind of antagonist sort of circuit where you could do a fly, then you could go to a bent over row. You could then go to a triceps extension, go to a curl, go back to your fly exercise, give it 45, 60 seconds between sets. And that might be a way that you can just make it a little bit more time efficient. Yes, none of those exercises are going to be perfect, but it's going to allow you to at least get a little bit more musculature in that one session.
Yeah, I mean, for me, that would probably push me to the point I wouldn't probably be able to do all of that in one session. That'd probably be too many sets for me. But
Yeah, I mean, that would probably be 6 if we're doing full upper body, if we get direct arm work in, and we've got our 2 lower body. But, someone might say maybe a high pro for them is lower body, so then it's
30 sets in a workout. That's not going to happen for me.
You never had your Poliquin days. I remember doing bloody
Never.
or
No.
Gronda days.
As I said, the thing is, I started out, my interest in this whole kind of strength training thing started out with very much a strength focus. I wanted to, kind of get really high weighted pull up and dip numbers. I wanted to get one arm chins. That was kind of what I got into as a starting point. And I kind of graduated into a more bodybuilding mentality. I wouldn't say I've ever been a bodybuilder by any means, but just more of a bodybuilding mentality as I kind of stopped aiming for specific numbers, goals. And just wanted to train for the sake of training and health and all the rest of it. So never really gone down that volume route. So when I was doing weighted pull-ups and dips, I was just doing 2 or 3 workouts a week with maybe sort of 3 sets per kind of workout for each muscle group, each exercise. And they're probably doing between 2 and 4 repetitions each time with a rep in reserve, something like that. So I've never really kind of been in that zone. It's never something that's been part of my life.
Very different experience to what brought me into this space. Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
totally.
some of my workouts used to be like a Gronda workout. We'd be doing 4 or 6 exercises, 8 sets of each exercise. 50 sets in a workout was
cardio.
Yeah, well, effectively it was. Yeah. Okay. Any other creative ways you can think about tackling this? I mean, bearing in mind, someone may not be limited by duration in that single session. It may simply be, hey, I can only get to a gym once a week, but when I'm there, I can spend 2 hours.
Okay. Well, then what you would do is something that you've pointed out before, which is you'd have an intra-workout break and go and get some orange juice and come back. And even if you did nothing other than that, so you did the first 2, like you did your upper body workout and then whatever, and then you went for a walk, had a refuel and came back an hour later or whatever and did the other half. Even if you just did that and didn't change anything else, I think that would still get you a higher quality workout because your motivation levels would be so much higher. You'd have no supraspinal CNS fatigue present because you'd have given yourself a chance to clear all the kind of metabolites out of your system. And you'd be able to do a far more stimulating job for the lower body. So, but yeah, then I can see a scenario where you might be able to do like maybe a single joint exercise at the end of so maybe you could throw some curls in after your body, and maybe you could throw some calf raises in after your and maybe that could get you to the 30.
Well,
Maybe
that
that
would
would,
be an interesting way. You do an upper lower split, right? So you do
you'd
your
basically be doing an intraday upper lower split. Yeah,
exactly, and then you could push it. Maybe someone can go to the gym twice on that day. Maybe they do an AM session and a PM session, like we've talked about in the past.
and I think you'd probably get the same kind of sort of structure there. You'd throw
Yep.
in, some single joint stuff at the end of
Yep.
each kind of
The
workout.
limitation is you still need those 5 sets. So you're still going to be limited to maybe 4 or 5 exercises per, like 4 or 5 upper, 4 or 5 lower.
I think you're going well off the end of why I would do
20
that.
sets. I thought you gave us 20 sets a moment ago.
Yeah,
So
but
I'm
you're,
going to
you're
push
now
you for 20 sets.
you're now trying to do 2 of those in the same day. I mean, I think a more reasonable solution would be to do 3 exercises per session, and even that third exercise, I would want to be a single joint one. I think that unless you're really kind of saying, oh no, the gym is literally like not very far away. It's just that, and so I can go there first thing in the morning, and then I can spend the whole day doing something else, and then go there last thing at night. I think you're now pushing the boundaries of this constraints of this system. But in that extreme case where somebody can go to the gym like on 1 day a week, but they can go once in the very first thing in the morning, that's almost going twice a week now, really, because you're pushing those to like 12 hours apart. You're almost saying that you're going twice a week at that point. I think you're pushing the
I think a
boundaries
lot
of
of
this
people, I
problem.
think there's probably a lot of younger
Squeaky.
people who are listening to this who'd be like, you know what, I could easily do 4 sets of 5, give it a
What
few
it is
hours
to be
off,
young. Wow, that's a long time
come
ago.
back. I can still remember it. I'm like, I don't think I would do it.
The world was a
But
different place when I was that age. Yeah, so yeah, but you start pushing the constraints of this problem to the squeaking point, and okay, fine, maybe you're basically doing 2 separate workouts, one in the very early morning, one in the late evening. Then yeah, but honestly, that's almost like training twice a week, and I don't think that's really the problem that we're trying
we've
to
given
attack.
the whole continuum here.
We
We've
have,
given right from just 4 exercises, 5 sets
in a
done in
single
one
session.
session. Yeah, to having a little intermission, to doing a bit more of a maximalist approach within that single session, to splitting it up more fully and bookending the day with 2 sessions. And I think, if someone is stuck in this situation, you would potentially have people on all ends of that continuum where they're like, you know what, I actually want to do everything I can to maximize this 1 day a week.
But I think the most feasible options are either going to be just going to the gym and doing the whole thing in one go, or they're going to be what you've pointed out before, which is do your first 2 or 3 if you want to kind of do that single joint one. Go and get a break, have a snack or some orange juice, have a walk round, chill, come back an hour later and do the other half. I actually think if people do genuinely have a whole afternoon free once a week, when that to me feels like it hits the sweet spot much better than the idea of trying to do 2 workouts,
2 full sessions. And the variant of that, which surprisingly I've actually had a number of people tell me this is what they do, is they may have some equipment at home. And obviously they don't have a full gym, but they may have a squat rack, or they may have dumbbells, or whatever it is. And they're like, hey, here's these 1 or 2 exercises I can really easily do effectively at home, and all these other exercises I can't. So for them, it might be, okay, you go to the gym and you do your 4 exercises at the gym, and then you have that one, maybe you've got the squat rack, and then maybe you do squats in the evening at home, or whatever that one exercise is.
Pull-up bar,
Yeah,
or
or
whatever.
pull-up. Exactly right, exactly. I think that is if you've got the means of making that work, I think that's a really interesting way of doing it as well.
Yeah. I think that hopefully is enough to answer the question that we've been posed. I mean, I think that's a really solid set of answers, to be honest.
Yeah, I think there's plenty of options there. Or one could throw in some physiological drop sets and do it in. I don't know how I would make that work. It would. Yeah, how would you quantify that? I don't think it would work very well, would it?
It wouldn't be my first choice. No, I think
you could conclude your set.
Honestly, I
set.
think that given the mental demand that you're placing yourself under to do all of this, I think it helps to simplify other aspects of the program as much as possible.
Your vanilla workout plan
is probably the best way to go.
Okay. Anything else you can think of that's worth mentioning when it comes to training once a week?
No, I think we've shoehorned everything in there that we can possibly think of.
I've got one last one for you. A question people do come up with is, well, what if I do posing? Will that help me maintain what I got in that session? Midweek posing.
Um, it depends on how much of a co-contraction you're getting. I mean, co-contractions, if they're done with max effort, they will essentially function like isometric contractions. You're just providing antagonist muscles as resistance to agonist muscles. So it's basically the same as doing isometrics, which, as we know from a lot of exercise physiology studies, produces pretty meaningful hypertrophy. So it depends on exactly what kind of level of effort you're putting into the muscular contraction that's involved in the posing.
Yeah. So basically, yes, it could work, but it comes down to you and your posing
Exactly how
ability.
you're doing it. Yeah.
Yep. Yep. Fair. Okay. Thank you. And thank you for everyone who listened. And if you have thought of a better way to do a 1 time per week program, then please let us know. Because I do think some of these questions do help us think creatively. And I think that that's the exciting part in some of this is sometimes there might be stuff we can look at and think, hey, you know what? That's a way of thinking outside the box. So if you've done that, by all means, shoot us a message, let us know. And until next time, I hope you guys have fun experimenting and let us know what you come up with.